Picture this for a second. You're standing on a bluff looking north across the Trinity River. Down below, the river runs east. And on the far side is Dallas. Not the city we know today, but a smaller, growing place still figuring itself out. Where you're standing, there's not much yet. No streets, no neighborhoods, no real infrastructure quite yet. Just open land. Trees high above the river. This river really matters. It wasn't just something that you crossed. It marked a real divide, physically and psychologically. Dallas was on the other side. Everything south was something else, something separate, a little removed. This wasn't empty land. Long before anyone called this place Oak Cliff, native peoples moved through and lived along the river and its creeks. And by the early 1800s, settlers were there too. Farmers farming the land, working the soil, building small lives just across the river from Dallas. By the 1840s, people like William Henry Horde had settled here, running a boarding house and farming the ridge. The area actually became known as Horde's Ridge. It wasn't a grand vision. It was practical, rural, a working place where people lived because the land made sense. So Oak Cliff didn't begin as a neighborhood of Dallas, and it didn't even have a master planned community mindset at first. It began as land, as settlement, as people choosing to live far enough away. The idea will come back later. Certainly when the developers look at this later, they look at the bluff, this location, this distance from the city, and they saw opportunity. They asked a different question. What if this could become something more intentional? What if you built a town here, close to Dallas, but not a part of it? That decision, as we'll see, changed everything. What grew out of this bluff became a town, then a city, and eventually, after real debate and a narrow vote, it became a part of Dallas. But even now, more than a century later, Oak Cliff still feels distinct. Like it remembers what it was before it was absorbed. Today, instead of doing a normal interview, we want to take a step back and tell the origin story of Oak Cliff, how Oak Cliff actually began, and why that beginning still matters. This is the hidden city, and this is where Oak Cliff starts. Welcome to the Hidden City Podcast. I'm Grant.
And I'm Doug, and we're here to share some of the incredible stories and people from Oak Cliff that you might not know.
We're going to sit down with some of the visionaries, craftsmen, and business owners who have shaped Oak Cliff into what it is today.
Oak Cliff is on the south bank of the Trinity River, a few miles south of downtown Dallas. While technically it was part of Dallas, it was its own city for a long time, and it still has that independent spirit.
We'll dive into the history and the spirit of this place, exploring the different challenges and successes that defined it.
This is The Hidden City, a podcast about the people and the stories that make Oak Cliff extraordinary. So why tell this story at all? Because most of us experience Oak Cliff as it is right now, as neighborhoods. As streets we drive every day, as restaurants, schools, churches, and businesses that feel established, like they've always been here. But places don't just happen. They're shaped by decisions, by geography, by moments, where people choose one direction instead of another. Oak Cliff is just a good example of that. From the beginning, this place was shaped by separation, by a river that created distance from Dallas, and by the decision again and again to build something just outside the center rather than the inside of it. That choice shows up in ways that we still feel today. You hear it when people talk about Oak Cliff like it's its own thing. You see it in the loyalty people have to their neighborhoods. You feel it in the skepticism, sometimes that's healthy, sometimes stubborn, towards whatever is happening across the river. That didn't come out of nowhere. Oak Cliff started as land, and then as a settlement, and then as a deliberate attempt to create a different kind of town. It was planned, marketed, argued over, and eventually it was absorbed into a larger city, but never fully dissolved by it. Understanding that helps explain why Oak Cliff has always had a strong sense of self, why it's gone through cycles of growth and neglect, investment and disinvestment, and still managed to hold on to a core identity. This story also matters because it reminds us of the history isn't just something that happens back then. It's something that we're living inside of. The street layouts, the neighborhood boundaries, and even the way people talk about Oak Cliff today, those are all downstream from the decisions made more than 100 years ago. And finally, it matters because Oak Cliff's story is a story about tension, about independence versus survival, about vision versus reality, and what happens when a place is close to power, but not quite at the center of it. Well, that tension is still here. And if you live in Oak Cliff, work in Oak Cliff, or care about that part of the city, you've probably felt it, even if you've never named it. So this episode, it isn't about nostalgia. It's not about saying things were better or worse back then. It's about understanding where this place came from, so we can better understand what it is now. To do that, we have to go back, not to Oak Cliff as a neighborhood, but to Oak Cliff as an idea.
Before Oak Cliff was ever a plan or even a name, it was already a place shaped by a few very different kinds of people. One of the most important was William Henry Hoard. Hoard arrived in the 1840s. We mentioned him a minute ago, and he settled on the high ground just south of the Trinity River. He built a cabin, ran a boarding house, he farmed the land, and he made a living in a way that kind of made sense for the time. It was practical, it was local, and it was rooted in the land itself. The ridge where he lived became known as Hoard's Ridge, and that name stuck for decades. Not because Hoard was famous, but because his presence represented something real. This wasn't speculative land, it was lived-in land, worked land. People crossed the river from Dallas, not to escape the world, but to survive in it. To farm, to trade, to host travelers moving through the area. Hoard's Ridge was rural, quiet, and functional, but it was all connected. And then just a few miles away, something very different was happening. In the early 1850s, a group of European settlers, they were mostly French, but there was some Belgian and Swiss immigrants as well. They arrived in North Texas with a radical idea. They called it La Reunion. La Reunion was a utopian socialist experiment. Its founders believed they could build a perfect society based on shared labor, education, and equality. They weren't farmers by trade. Many were artists, intellectuals, and craftsmen. And the North Texas frontier turned out to be far less forgiving than they expected. The colony struggled almost immediately. The soil, even though there were farmers here, was really tough. The climate was also harsher than advertised. Disease and isolation took their toll, and within a few years, La Reunion collapsed. But its influence didn't disappear. Many of the colonists stayed in the area and moved into Dallas, bringing with them skills in art, music, design, and education. And in a strange way, one of Dallas's earliest cultural influences came from a failed experiment just west of what would later become Oak Cliff. So in the same stretch of land, you had two very different stories unfolding at once. On one hand, you had William Hoard and the other settlers building slow, practical lives shaped by the land itself. On the other, La Reunion, a bold, idealistic attempt to imagine an entirely new way of living. Both ultimately failed in their own ways to become the future of the area, but together they tell us something important about Oak Cliff. From the beginning, this side of the river attracted people willing to try something different. Some were practical, some were idealistic, some were just trying to make a living, but they all were drawn here because this land, just beyond Dallas, across the river, felt like a place where new ideas could take root. That mix of realism and ambition is still part of Oak Cliff's story today. And it sets the stage for what comes next. When developers look at Hoard's Ridge, they look at this land with history and possibility, and they decide to turn it into something intentional.
By the late 1880s, the land south of the Trinity had already proven something important. People could live here, farm here, build lives here, It wasn't theoretical anymore. And that's where these two men entered the story who saw something more. Thomas L. Marsalis and John S. Armstrong weren't settlers in the horde's sense. They were developers. And they weren't interested in slow, organic growth. They were interested in scale. In 1887, they began purchasing hundreds of acres around Hoard's Ridge. They gave that area a new name, Oak Cliff, after the massive oak trees that crown the bluffs around the river. And with that name came a plan. This is the moment Oak Cliff shifts from a place people happen to live into a place intentionally designed to be something specific. Oak Cliff was marketed as a healthier, higher, and more refined version than Dallas. The elevation mattered. The air mattered. The distance from the city, just across the river, wasn't a drawback. It was the selling point. But Marsalis understood something crucial. If Oak Cliff was going to succeed, it couldn't feel isolated. So he pushed forward a rail connection across the Trinity, making it possible to live in Oak Cliff and still move easily into Dallas. That connection changed everything. Oak Cliff wasn't just nearby anymore, it was accessible. And Marsalis didn't stop there. He invested in parks, entertainment, and public spaces. Oak Cliff wasn't meant to be a quiet bedroom community. It was meant to be a destination. For a while, it worked. Lots sold quickly, homes went up, businesses followed, and in 1890, Oak Cliff incorporated as its own city with a mayor, a council, and a growing sense of momentum. But big visions almost always come with internal tensions. Marsalis and Armstrong didn't agree on the future of Oak Cliff, or how much risk it was worth taking to get it there. Eventually, the partnership split. And that split tells you a lot about what happens next. Armstrong didn't just walk away. He crossed the river, took what he learned with him north of the Trinity, and Armstrong became involved in developing what would become Highland Park, another planned community, but one built around a very different philosophy. Highland Park leaned hard into exclusivity, controlled growth, and long-term insulation from financial risks. Marsalis stayed in Oak Cliff, and that choice mattered. Oak Cliff remained more ambitious, more public-facing, and more vulnerable to economic swings. It invested in shared spaces and entertainment and being open and accessible and trying to be a place for more people, not fewer. In a sense, that split between Marsalis and Armstrong created two parallel experiments, one north of the river and one south. Both were intentional, both planned, but they would age very differently. Marsalis doubled down on Oak Cliff, and for a time it paid off, but then came the panic of 1893 and the economy stalled. Investment dried up, development slowed, and Oak Cliff, now an independent city, found itself under real financial pressure. Maintaining infrastructure services and growth was expensive. Independence, it turned out, came with a cost that optimism alone couldn't cover. And that pressure led to a hard question. One Oak Cliff couldn't avoid forever. Could it survive on its own? By the early 1900s, the idea of annexation was on the table. Joining Dallas meant access to water systems, roads, municipal stability, but it also meant giving up something Oak Cliff had fought to establish: autonomy. The debate wasn't abstract, it was emotional. People understood what they stood to gain and what they might lose. And when the vote finally came in 1903, it passed by a narrow margin. Oak Cliff voted to annex itself into Dallas, and that vote to annex passed by a razor-thin margin, commonly reported as just an 18-vote difference. And not everyone believed it. They didn't think it reflected the will of the community, but there were questions about who voted, outside pressures from the Dallas interests on whether Oak Cliff was choosing annexation or being pushed towards it. Nevertheless, it happened. And on paper, Oak Cliff and Dallas were now one city. But in reality, the Trinity River was still there. The distance was still there, and the identity Oak Cliff had formed, first as a settlement, then as a city, didn't disappear overnight. In many ways, it never disappeared at all.
What's easy to miss after the annexation is this. Oak Cliff didn't disappear into Dallas. In fact, this is when Oak Cliff really starts to become itself. On paper, Oak Cliff was now a part of Dallas. It gained access to infrastructure, water systems, paved streets, utilities, and streetcars that made daily life easier and more connected. But culturally, Oak Cliff didn't suddenly think of itself as just another part of the city. Instead, something else happened. Oak Cliff began to function like a collection of small towns stitched together. Neighborhoods began to matter even more. People identified with their streets, their churches, their schools, all within Oak Cliff. That sense of local belonging filled the space left behind when Oak Cliff gave up its status as an independent city. Streetcars played a big role in this. They didn't just connect Oak Cliff to downtown Dallas, they connected Oak Cliff to itself. Commercial corridors grew up along those lines, places where you could go shop, work, go see a movie, grab a meal, or run into someone you knew, all without ever crossing the river. Daily life became hyper-local. Oak Cliff wasn't waiting for Dallas to define itself. It was building a rhythm that felt complete on its own terms. You could live your entire life south of the Trinity River. You could work nearby, worship nearby, raise kids nearby, and you never felt cut off from the city or dependent on it. That really mattered, especially as the early decades of the 20th century unfolded. This was a period of steady growth in Oak Cliff. Their modest homes were filling up across the neighborhoods. Schools were expanding and growing. Churches became anchors, not just spiritually, but also socially. They hosted events, organized aid, and helped create a shared sense of responsibility for the community. Oak Cliff became a place where people put down deep roots. And while it wasn't flashy, it was stable. There was pride now in being from Oak Cliff, not because it was elite or exclusive, but because it felt solid and familiar. People knew their neighbors. They knew the shop owners. They knew which streetcar to catch and which one would eventually get them home the fastest. This era also helped cement something deeper in Oak Cliff's identity. Even as a part of Dallas, Oak Cliff learned how to take care of itself. Not out of defiance, but out of habit. It had already been independent once, and that muscle memory didn't disappear just because the city limits were changed. By the time you reach the 1920s and the 1930s, Oak Cliff isn't struggling to find its place, it has one. It's a working, living, growing community, close to the city center, but still very much its own. And that foundation sets the stage for what is to come next. Because when Oak Cliff enters the middle of the 20th century, it doesn't just survive, it flourishes.
By the time Oak Cliff reached the middle of the 20th century, it wasn't just trying to prove itself anymore. It already had. From the 1930s through the 1950s, Oak Cliff entered what many people describe as its golden years, not because everything was perfect, but because the community settled, it was confident and complete. Even through the Great Depression, Oak Cliff held together. Families stayed, neighborhoods stayed, daily life continued, and after World War II, that stability deepened. Returning veterans bought homes, families grew, schools expanded, churches filled, and Oak Cliff wasn't a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. It was a place they chose to stay. A lot of that life centered on Jefferson Boulevard. During these decades, Jefferson wasn't just a street, it was the commercial and social heart of Oak Cliff. Department stores, local shops, restaurants, theaters, and offices lined the boulevard. On weekends, sidewalks were full. People dressed up to go downtown. But downtown for Oak Cliff was Jefferson. You can spend an entire day there, shopping, eating, running into people you knew, catching a movie. It was busy, walkable, and alive. And it's important to say this clearly. Oak Cliff was not considered a marginal part of the city during this time. For many years, a significant number of Dallas's wealthier and more influential residents lived here, especially in areas like the hills and bluffs overlooking the river. Large homes established families, professionals, and business leaders made Oak Cliff their address. Before places like Highland Park fully consolidated wealth, Oak Cliff was seen as one of the most desirable places to live south or anywhere of the Trinity. But Oak Cliff was never exclusive, and that's the key distinction. Wealth existed alongside working families, small business owners, tradespeople, and renters. This mix shaped the culture, and Oak Cliff felt open, accessible, human. It didn't insulate itself, and it didn't try to curate what belonged. That openness showed up everywhere, on Jefferson, in neighborhood schools, in churches, and in the way people lived their daily lives. Commercial corridors beyond Jefferson thrived too, but Jefferson was the anchor. It gave Oak Cliff a shared center, a place that felt unmistakably its own. You didn't need to cross the river to find culture, entertainment, or opportunity. Oak Cliff had it right there. And because of that, life felt local. People knew their neighbors, they recognized shop owners, kids walked to school. Families had routines that revolved around a few familiar streets and places. Oak Cliff wasn't flashy or polished, but it was solid, and people were proud of that solidity. Even as part of Dallas, Oak Cliff still felt distinct, not in opposition to the city, but alongside it, close enough to benefit from growth, yet grounded enough to remain itself. Looking back, this balance is what made this era feel so complete. Oak Cliff wasn't chasing the next thing. It wasn't reinventing itself every decade. It was simply functioning day after day as a place where people belonged. But that same openness, the same lack of insulation, also made Oak Cliff vulnerable to the forces that would soon reshape American cities. Changes in transportation, housing policies, and investment patterns were already beginning to shift the ground beneath places like Jefferson Boulevard. In the 1940s and 50s, though, most people weren't thinking about that. They were living their lives. Oak Cliff wasn't a problem to be fixed, it was home.
Even at its height, Oak Cliff never tried to be polished. While other parts of Dallas were becoming more controlled, more insulated, more carefully curated, Oak Cliff stayed open, economically, socially, culturally, and places like that tend to produce a certain kind of person. They're not always safe, they're not always celebrated, but unmistakably original. Take Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Both grew up in and around West Dallas and Oak Cliff during years of real hardship. Poverty, instability, and limited opportunity weren't abstractions. They were daily realities. Their story was later romanticized, but it came out of a very specific environment, one where people lived close to the margins of a growing city without fully sharing in its prosperity. Bonnie and Clyde don't represent Oak Cliff at its best, but they do reflect something true about it. Oak Cliff has always existed close to the center of power without being fully embraced by it. That tension between proximity and exclusion can produce resilience, creativity, and rebellion in equal measure. And Oak Cliff didn't just produce outlaws, it produced artists. One of the most famous was Stevie Ray Vaughan. Stevie Ray grew up in Oak Cliff, and you could hear that upbringing in his music. The grit, the restraint, the way beauty and pain sit side by side. His sound wasn't polished or distant. It was raw, physical, and emotional. Music not as performance, but as necessity. That didn't come from nowhere. Oak Cliff gave him working class life, struggle, community, and music that was woven into everyday experience. It shaped how he played and it shaped how he listened. And Stevie Ray wasn't alone. Oak Cliff has long been a place where visual artists, musicians, writers, and makers found room to work without being smoothed over. One example is Frank Ray, a nationally recognized painter who grew up in Oak Cliff. His work reflected the same qualities that define the neighborhood itself: place-based, expressive, and unafraid of the edges. And even earlier, the roots of electric blues ran straight through Dallas and Oak Cliff. T-Bone Walker, one of the great pioneers of electric guitar, developed his sound here. That innovation, taking something raw and traditional and pushing it forward, mirrors Oak Cliff itself. Grounded in place, but never stuck. That's the through line. Oak Cliff tends to produce people who don't fit neatly into the center. People who work from the edges. People who make something real, not because it's marketable, but because it's necessary. That's true whether you're talking about a blues guitarist, a painter, an outlaw, or a family that's lived here for generations. Oak Cliff has always been a place where life isn't curated. It's lived. Where success and struggle exist side by side. Where culture comes from experience, not polish. And that same openness, that same lack of insulation, helped Oak Cliff thrive during its best years. But it also meant that when forces shaping American cities began to change, Oak Cliff wasn't protected. It was exposed, and that's where the story turns next.
The change didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a single moment when Oak Cliff stopped working or stopped mattering. What came instead was a slow, uneven slide, one shaped by forces much larger than any one neighborhood. By the 1960s, American cities were being reorganized. Streetcars disappeared. Highways took their place. Suburbs expanded outward, and public policy increasingly encouraged people with means to leave older, mixed neighborhoods for newer developments on the edge of the city. Oak Cliff felt all of it. Highways cut through established neighborhoods, physically dividing communities that had once been tightly connected. Long-standing commercial patterns were disrupted, and the same streetcar lines that had once fed places like Jefferson Boulevard vanished, taking foot traffic and daily rhythm with them. At the same time, investment followed mobility. As suburban growth accelerated and what's often called white flight reshaped cities across the country, capital, infrastructure, and political attention moved outward. This wasn't just another individual choice. It was about incentives, zoning, lending practices, and where resources were directed. Neighborhoods like Oak Cliff were left carrying the weight of that transition with fewer supporters. Jefferson Boulevard tells that story clearly. Once the commercial and social heart of Oak Cliff, it began to hollow out. Department stores closed, small shops struggled, and what had been a destination became a corridor that people passed through. Not because the community stopped caring, but because the systems that sustained it had moved elsewhere. Disinvestment followed, schools became under-resourced, and infrastructure aged. Redlining and housing policy made it harder for residents to access credit and harder for businesses to survive. Families who had the ability to leave often did, not because Oak Cliff had failed them, but because success was increasingly defined as going somewhere else. And yet, Oak Cliff didn't vanish. What remained were the people who stayed, families who couldn't leave, families who wouldn't leave, churches that kept their doors open, and neighborhood networks that quietly did the work of care when institutions fell short. Through the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s, Oak Cliff carried a reputation it didn't fully choose. Media narratives focused on crime and decline. Outsiders talked about the area as a problem to be managed rather than a place to be understood. But underneath those headlines, life continued. Kids still went to school, music was still played, and art was still made. Small businesses still opened up and closed. Oak Cliff learned, and again, how to survive without attention. In some ways, this period hardened Oak Cliff's identity. It deepened skepticism towards outside promises, and it strengthened neighborhood loyalty. It made memory matter, because when investment disappears, what's left is the people and places. By the 1990s, Oak Cliff wasn't the thriving, confident place it had been mid-century, but it wasn't gone either. It was still here, in the endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, and often overlooked, is what made what came next possible.
By the late 1990s and the early 2000s, something began to shift. Not all at once, not evenly, but in ways that felt organic or almost familiar. After decades of disinvestment, people started looking at Oak Cliff differently again. Some were longtime residents who had stayed through the hardest years and were ready to reinvest. Others were newcomers, artists, entrepreneurs, new families, drawn by affordability, history, and the sense that this place had a spirit you couldn't manufacture. One of the clearest signs of that turn came in what we now call Bishop Arts District. What had once been a struggling commercial strip began to come back, not as a replica of the past, but as something new, rooted in the old buildings and walkable streets. Small shops, restaurants, galleries, and music venues opened up. It felt local. It felt human scale. It felt like Oak Cliff was finding its footing again. Around the same time, organizations like Go Oak Cliff began doing the slow, unglamorous work of community. They were building community, supporting local businesses, celebrating neighborhood identity, and reminding people that Oak Cliff's value wasn't just economic. It was cultural. It was historical, and it was relational. This wasn't revival by erasure. It was revival by attention. Landmarks that had always mattered began to matter again in visible ways. Take the Texas Theater, a place layered with complicated history with Lee Harvey Oswald. That theater was restored and reopened, not as a museum piece, but as a living venue. Movies, events, gatherings. Places like the Kessler came back online, becoming spaces where art and music and community could gather again. Not overproduced, just good rooms where people could show up. And then there's the Belmont Hotel, perched on the bluff, quietly watching the city the way it always has. Renovated, reimagined, but still unmistakably itself. A symbol of Oak Cliff's long view, its patience. Together, these weren't isolated wins. They were signals. Oak Cliff wasn't being rediscovered as much as remembered. But with that attention came familiar tension. Rising interest brought rising costs. Property values climbed. Longtime residents worried, rightly, about being pushed out of the place they had held together when no one else was paying attention. Oak Cliff had seen cycles before. It knew about revival without care could quickly become replacement. So the question became sharper. Who was Oak Cliff for? Oak Cliff today is many things at once. It's families whose roots go back generations, still living on the same streets. It's newcomers trying to learn the place rather than override it. It's creativity and pride. It's anxiety and hope living side by side. What hasn't changed is the underlying character. That lives on. Oak Cliff still values places over polished things. Memory over hype. People over plans. There's a deep skepticism here toward outside narratives or quick fixes or towards anything that feels disconnected from the lived experience. That skepticism was earned over time. Oak Cliff remembers what it means to be overlooked. It also remembers what it means to be desirable. So today, Oak Cliff lives in tension between growth and preservation, between opportunity and displacement, between honoring the past and making room for the future. And that tension isn't a flaw. It's a feature. It's the story. Because from the beginning, from Hoard's Ridge to La Reunion, from Marsalis to Annexation, from Jefferson Boulevard at its peak to the long slide in the final turn most recently, Oak Cliff has always been shaped by people, choosing to live their lives just outside the center and making something of it. It's not perfect, it's not polished, but it is real. Oak Cliff isn't a blank canvas, it's a layered place, a place of memory. It's a place whose spirit keeps showing up in new businesses, in old buildings, and the people who care enough to stay. That spirit is still here.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Hidden City. We hope you discovered something about Oak Cliff that you didn't know. If you enjoyed the show, I hope you subscribe to it on YouTube and then follow us on any of the podcasting platforms. Also, if you enjoyed it, please share with a friend, and thanks so much for tuning in.